All right. Well, thank you for the songs this evening. We're going to return to Matthew 24. So, in our study through the Gospel of Matthew, this is message number 62, entitled The Return of Christ. We are looking this evening at Matthew chapter 24, verses 23 to 35. And so, to get started, I'm going to read verses 23 and 24. Then, if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall so show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So, chapters 23 to 25 are the fifth and final long section of teaching in Matthew's Gospel. Chapter 23 is a long public teaching where Jesus is at the temple. He is speaking to the crowds at the temple, as well as his disciples, as well as the leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees that are present. And he primarily there focuses on the judgment that is pronounced on that generation of Israel to whom Christ came. And he gives rebukes and warnings to the scribes and Pharisees. And it ends with Jesus lamenting over Jerusalem, that he had come to Jerusalem and he would have gathered Israel, but they were not willing. And their rejection meant a coming desolation of Jerusalem. So then chapters 24 and 25 that are sort of part two of this long teaching section they form a section that Jesus taught privately to his 12 apostles, and it is given to them in response to the questions that they asked in chapter 24 and verse number 3 about when will these things be that Jesus has been talking about. What's the sign of his coming and the end of the age? Now, in verses 4 through 31, Jesus is speaking about the end of the age, and he speaks about it as a time of birth, pain, sorrows, and a time of great tribulation. And this is a limited time period, and it is immediately followed by the coming of the Son of Man in power and glory, which is what we're looking at tonight. But he referred to certain specific events during this time, like the abomination of desolation that was prophesied beforehand by Daniel. And many of the prophets, beginning with Moses, spoke of this same time. In other words, that there's going to be a future time of tribulation, a time of judgment, known sometimes as the day of the Lord, where the wrath of God is going to purge Israel and the nations of the earth before that Israel is restored. And so Jesus doesn't here specify the duration of this time of tribulation that he's talking about, although he does give indication that it is a limited or a short time. But Daniel and John later in the book of Revelation in particular, they do give more timing information so that we know that the tribulation is designated for 7 years. And it's divided by a central event into two halves, a first 3.5 years and a second 3.5 years that correspond with what Jesus spoke of as the beginning birth pains and then the time of great tribulation later. So Jesus referred to this central event, this abomination of desolation in the temple by the person that we know as the Antichrist or the prince who will come, the willful king, the man of lawlessness and such titles, the beast. Jesus referred to this central event as marking off these two parts of this time of tribulation. Now, again, the focus that Jesus has in what we're looking at in Matthew 24 is the signs of the end of the age, judgment, and the coming of Christ, which we know as his second coming or his return to the earth. So in verses 23 to 35 that we're looking at here tonight, Jesus speaks particularly about his coming, about his return to the earth. Now recall that the apostles had asked him about his coming, and they did not have the conception in their minds of Jesus going to heaven and then returning from heaven to the earth, but rather they were thinking about his appearing as king, which he had not to that point done. But Jesus speaks about his coming with the clouds, in other words, from heaven. And we know later from the book of Acts and other places that the disciples understood that Jesus was going to return to the Father and be at the right hand of the Father until the time of the end. So just like the events of the tribulation that Jesus has spoken about here, his return will be unmistakable. And that's exactly what he's been saying about this time of the tribulation, this time of the end of the age. It's going to be unmistakable. It's going to be visible. It's going to be known. Now he tells us that there will be no shortage of false Christs and false prophets that will try to lead people away. But nevertheless, he continues to emphasize, don't be deceived. This is as he said in the previous section, this is a time unlike any other. There will be no question about what is going on. So when we look at this passage, we're going to break it down into three parts. In verses 23 to 28, where Jesus begins with this warning about the false Christs and that his coming is not going to be here or there. In verses 29 to 31, where Jesus speaks of his coming with the clouds. And in verses 32 to 35, where he gives them the parable of the fig tree. So let's look at this first part here, beginning with verse number 23. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. So Jesus had wrapped up his discussion of this time of tribulation, and he wraps it up with a warning about false messages. And he continues to emphasize not being deceived. These things that he's talking about are known, they are knowable, they will be visible, they will be evident. And so don't believe any, in essence, who think it necessary to point out that Christ has come, has already come. The coming of Christ will not be of such a nature that he could return and someone would have to let someone know and tell him where he is. Oh, well, Christ has returned. He has come. He's over here. He's over there. Let's go see him. Well, his return is not of that kind of a nature. It's not of that kind of an event. So when you think about his birth, his first coming into the world, and you had the wise men, the magi that have traveled, and they're inquiring, where is he that is born King of the Jews? And they find out where he's at. Of course, Herod inquires about this, and where does it say that he will be born, and all this sort of stuff. And they're sort of looking for him, and there's kind of a little bit of word that Jesus has come, Messiah has been born. Well, his return, it's not going to be like that. It's not going to be like that at all. It's not going to be such an event that someone would have to tell someone else, well, it's happened and he's over here, so you can go see him. So that's how Jesus starts this part. In verse number 24, he gives this explanation. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So Jesus explained that these false messiahs and false prophets will rise up. There'll be an abundance of them during this time. And they're seeking to deceive people. And not only will they speak very convincing words, but he also says that they will work great signs and wonders. Now, obviously, they will be empowered by Satan. They will have demonic power. They're going to work great signs, great wonders, and such in an effort to deceive people. So their power will be great. But notice that Jesus adds that if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect, meaning that it's not possible. It's not going to be possible for them to deceive the very elect. Now, Jesus continues to use this term elect, and the word here just simply means chosen. He continues to use this term in this passage, and oftentimes in the Old Testament, this is a term that is used in reference to Israel particularly, but especially it's used in reference to the believing remnant of Israel. And Paul uses it that way in Romans chapter 9 and verse 11 and chapter 11, verse 5 and verse 28. You recall in Romans 9 to 11 how Paul is talking about the fact that there's an unbelieving majority of Israel in the first century doesn't mean that God's word has failed. He still has a remnant of which Paul is a member, that he makes that point. And his point comes down that all Israel are not Israel. In other words, just those descended from Jacob are not of the chosen ones, but rather there's an election according to grace. And he speaks of this and essentially builds up to chapter 11 saying that all Israel will be saved. There will come a time when that nation will be so purged at the end of this time that all Israel will be saved. In other words, an entirely saved Israel is going to enter into that kingdom. And that's who is being referred to as the elect. So Israel is a chosen nation. And within that nation, there are those who are elect according to grace. Every individual descendant from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not going to be saved. And that's never been the case, and that's never been the promise. And so that is made clear. Now, once again, when we look at what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 24, and talking, obviously the question begins with thinking about Jerusalem and the temple and all of these sort of things. He makes this reference to Daniel's prophecy. And remember that the angel Gabriel told Daniel that this is a time that is determined for his people, for the people of Israel, for the city of Jerusalem, and for the sanctuary, and having to do with the coming of the Messiah and ultimately the restoration of Israel. So again, there's no question that Jesus is talking here about those that will not be deceived, that he is primarily referring to those of Israel, that believing remnant of Israel in this time. Verse 25, he says, "Behold, I have told you before." So Jesus essentially makes a declaration here that he's telling them beforehand. In other words, he's foretelling of these events. He's prophesying of these events. He's emphasizing the fact that he is speaking prophecy. And he's going to later, we'll see, talk about the surety of all of those things being fulfilled. Verse 26, "Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not." So he gives, because of this, because of his coming, because of his warning that he's given, all of these things, he's saying, don't believe those who will say that Jesus has returned, he is here, he is there, the desert, the secret chamber, wherever. Again, do not be deceived about this. Just continuing to echo this message. And then in verse 27, he says, "For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." So he goes on here in verses 27 and 28, and he uses two expressions to liken or to compare the second coming to. The first that he uses here in verse 27 is a flash of lightning. A flash of lightning that lights up across the sky. The point is that it's visible and it's noticeable. Everyone looking at the sky can see it. It's not something that's just a little blip in some obscure place. That's just the point of the image that he's saying. And in the second, verse 28, he says, "For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." So he's using a second expression here And essentially he's saying that it's the same, that where a group of carrion birds are seen in the distance signals where a dead carcass is. So the point is that there are these things that he's talking about are visible, they are observable. There's no need for some specially enlightened person to point it out to you. It's unmistakable. Now, this image of the eagles gathering, or the vultures, the bird carrion birds that's being referred to, is also used to this exact same effect in Job chapter 39, verses 27 to 30. He's not there talking about the second coming of Christ, but it's the same image that's used in this same way. So these two images are working together. The flash of lightning across the sky and a circling group of carrion birds that you can see in the sky in the distance. And what is the point? The point is that these are observable. They're unmistakable. They're easily seen and noticed, and they announce something. They tell us something. Well, let me go to the second part where Jesus speaks now particularly about his coming on the clouds. Verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So this word here, immediately, right away. In other words, there's not some long passage of time. It's right away, and also it's also showing that it's connected to. So all of this tribulation that comes before this second coming that he's leading into is connected to it. It's going to come right away, and we continue to see how Jesus is working through here in Matthew 24. And he's giving us a sequence of events that this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and so on. And so we're still seeing emphasis on that sequence. So after these tribulations described, Jesus says that there will be apocalyptic signs, cosmic signs, signs of the heavens. Things like the darkening of the sun and the moon, and the falling of stars and the shaking of the heavens. And these are the kind of signs that are prophesied about concerning the day of the Lord. So I'll give you a sample of those. Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 to 10. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel, both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. And he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Joel chapter 2 and verse 10. The earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. And down in verse 31, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. Joel 3:15, the sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. So again, here's a sample of passages in the Old Testament related to this future day of the Lord, this coming time of the wrath of God upon the earth, and saying that it's going to be accompanied with these signs of the heavens, the darkening of the sun and moon, the shaking and falling of the stars of the heavens, and so on. And so Jesus says the same thing right here, right before his coming, that right after the tribulation of those days, that these cosmic apocalyptic signs of the heavens will be seen. Then in verse 30, and notice again these sequence terms, and then, meaning after this, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So with these apocalyptic signs of the heavens is the coming of the Lord in power and great glory. This is the appearance of the Son of Man, as it's prophesied in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. So this coming up, this appearing of the Son of Man with the clouds of heaven is followed by the establishment of a kingdom on the earth that will never pass away. So it is talking about this same time, this coming of the Lord. Now notice what else that Jesus said here. He said that all the tribes of the earth would mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming, and they will mourn. Now, the word for earth that is used here is actually a word that means land. Sometimes it can refer to the earth in terms of soil. Sometimes it can refer to land in terms of territory. And sometimes it can be used to in a global sense of the earth. But he says here that the tribes of the land, and this reference to the tribes of the land is a reference to the tribes of Israel who will see the coming of the Son of Man. They'll see the coming of the Messiah, and they will mourn for him. So he is referring here to the prophecy in Zechariah chapter 12, verses 10 to 13. And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. In that day shall there be a great mourning in Jerusalem, as the mourning of Hadad-rimmon in the valley of Megiddon, and the land shall mourn, every family apart, the family of the house of David apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Nathan apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Levi apart, and their wives apart, the family of Shimei apart, and their wives apart, and so on. All the tribes, that they will mourn his appearing. They'll look on him whom they have pierced. And they will confess and they will repent, as is prophesied in Isaiah chapter 53. And they will be converted to Jesus Christ. So in other words, at that point, you have a believing remnant within Israel that is alive on the earth. And then you have a larger part of Israel that will be converted at his coming. And of course, there will be a purging of Israel such that the wicked and unbelieving will be cast out at this time. Verse 31. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Now, one of the things that we saw earlier, particularly related to the abomination of desolations, and that idea of desolations means desertion, being abandoned. Sometimes it's a phrase used in the Old Testament to refer to like an abandoned house or an abandoned city. And the temple in Jerusalem will be abandoned by those of Israel because of the persecutions that come when the Antichrist commits the abomination that desolates the temple, and all the services of the temple then cease, and persecution against them will be the severest that has ever been among the nations, and they will be scattered. But at his return, he will gather them, just as has been prophesied for a long, long time. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros, from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea, among all these nations. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah. Notice this, from the four corners of the earth. And we have the gathering here from the four winds. Notice this passage in Isaiah chapter 27 and verse 13. And it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, the shofar the blowing of the shofar, and they shall come, which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria and the outcast in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. We not too long ago looked at Psalm 150 that speaks of this time and the blast of the shofar that signals the praise of the Lord that has come to the earth. The outcast in the land of Egypt shall worship in the Lord of the holy mountain at Jerusalem. Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 14 and 15. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But rather it's going to be said, here in verse 15, but the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands whither he had driven them. And I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. And again, beginning all the way back with Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 64. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And there shalt thou serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And of course, he goes on to prophesy that they will be gathered. Well, let me get to the last part of this, verses 32 to 35, where Jesus gives this parable of the fig tree. Verse 32, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So having spoken of the signs of the end of the age and his coming again, in other words, the signs of the end of the age that he's talking about, these are the things that will happen. These are the events of the end of the age. And all of these are signifying what's ultimately going to happen in connection with this, and that is the return of Christ. So he has spoken about the signs of the end of the age and his coming again. And here in this part, Jesus is actually transitioning towards speaking about timing. Remember that the 12 had asked him, when will these things be? When will this take place? When will this happen? So Jesus is sort of transitioning toward that in this part. And he gives them this parable of the fig tree. It's very simple. You see a fig tree and you see the leaves budding on the fig tree, and you know that summer is near. And it's very simple. We've seen the seasons pass, and every year we go into the wintertime and we get the brown death that occurs, and everything is brown and ugly and dead. And then as we start getting into spring and we start seeing the green appear, we start seeing the leaves coming back, we start seeing the flowers budding, and we know that summer is coming, and it's not going to be long, and there's going to be a harvest and all of those sort of things. So it's very easy, very simple to understand. So Jesus is just making a comparison here. You're able to understand this. Now remember, at one point he had actually rebuked the Pharisees because they were able to discern the signs of the sky, but not the signs of the times that they were living in their visitation. So this is simple enough. Verse 33, so likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. So Jesus says, in like manner, when you see all these things that have come to pass, meaning what? Meaning all of these things he's just talked about leading up to his return. All of these different events, all these are signs of his very, very soon coming. So when these things are seen, when these things have come to pass, his return is right at the very door. You know his coming is very soon to happen. So actually, when you think about it, this again goes along with what Jesus has been doing as he has been emphasizing the visibility and the certainty of knowing about his coming. And so these signs are unmistakable. And when you see these things, it's unmistakable that his return is very, very, very soon. Verse 34. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. So he gives this familiar revelation formula. Truly, I say to you. So in other words, Jesus is here giving them revelation. This is him speaking with authority, not like scribes, not even like prophets. He is speaking as God, the Word of God. I say unto you, the generation that sees, notice, all these things. So who is it? Who's this generation that Jesus speaks of? And I don't have time to trace down all the many different answers. I don't know, and there are many of them that people give to this question. But there are many that say that it's this immediate generation in the first century. So Jesus is looking at these 12 apostles, and he says to them, the generation that sees these things shall not pass till all these things are fulfilled. And we've noticed how that he has said you and you and you and you all throughout this teaching here in Matthew chapter 24. So we previously discussed that second person plural usage of you or you all. And we noted how common it was, particularly in prophetic passages, that the immediate audience being addressed with a second person plural wasn't the ones that would actually experience the fulfillment, but was some future generation from them that would actually experience that. And we noticed that many times this comes up in the prophecies of Moses and the words that he's spoken particularly in Leviticus and Deuteronomy especially. But there's other places in Numbers as well. So we talked about this, and we talked about how that the disciples here make a very good representative audience for the remnant believers in the midst of that generation of Israel experiencing the tribulation. And so I mentioned that there was another important reason besides seeing that usage in previous passages. There's another important reason to understand that second person plural to be addressing some future generation of Israel. Now, one reason that I could give for that would be to simply say, well, historically, all these things did not happen in the first century, in the lifetime of the apostles, nor have all these things happened in any time since then. Now, there are many that go to great lengths to try to prove that it did mean that immediate generation, and so they've spiritualized and allegorized Jesus' words to the point that they believe that this coming of Jesus spoken of here was actually the coming of Titus and the Roman army in 70 AD, fulfilling this prophecy of the coming of Christ by essentially saying it wasn't a personal, visible coming of Christ, but a judgment coming through the Romans. So that is a very common interpretation. Well, it is impossible that this means that first century generation. When Jesus said, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled, it's impossible. And it's impossible for an even greater reason than the passage of history and the fact that none of these things happened in the lifetime of that generation. So 2 different times, the Pharisees and the Sadducees asked Jesus for a sign from the heavens. They wanted an apocalyptic sign. This is Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 to 40, and again in chapter 16, verses 1 to 4. They requested to see cosmic signs, such as the ones we read earlier, that had been prophesied to accompany the day of the Lord and the coming of the Messiah. In other words, we don't want to see you heal a blind person. We don't want to see you heal leprosy. We don't even want to see you raise the dead. What we want to see is a sign from the heavens. That's what we want to see. They want to see the darkening of the sun and moon. They want to see the shaking of the stars. That's the apocalyptic signs of the day of the Lord that they asked to see. And in both cases, Jesus told them the same thing. Matthew 12:39, but he answered and said unto them, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. That's Matthew 12:39. Matthew 16:4, a wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. That generation to whom Jesus came, he said, would receive no signs other than the resurrection. It's the only sign that that generation would see. Well, the previous verses in Matthew 24 elaborate numerous signs, including the apocalyptic signs of the heavens for the end of the age and Jesus' return. So it is impossible that that generation would see all of those things come to pass. It simply cannot be, because Jesus said they wouldn't see any sign other than the resurrection. Verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So Jesus here again is asserting his divine authority as lawgiver and foreteller. And he assures that his words will not pass away, but they will all be fulfilled. Just as he said of the Old Testament that all would be fulfilled in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 18 in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus has continued to emphasize not being deceived about this time. And in this part of the teaching, it's specifically his return in power and glory that's being spoken of. And he stated very clearly that his return will not be missed. It will not be mistaken. It will not be mistakable. No one will need to convince anyone that he has returned or to tell them where to find him when he returns. And similarly, no one then would need convince us today that this return has already happened in 70 AD or at any other time for that matter. So don't be deceived about this time. Well, the end of the tribulation will see the coming of Jesus Christ with the clouds of heaven. And of course, Jesus will talk about what happens after this. In other words, he's not done. We still have more in chapter 24 and in all of chapter 25 to go, where Jesus is still talking about this. So we've got a lot more to go. This isn't everything. He'll talk about what happens after this and give this sequence of events. But we are given assurance that everything in this word is going to be fulfilled. That generation upon whom these signs come, they will all be fulfilled in that generation. In other words, it's not going to be an extended time, or it's not going to be partly fulfilled here and then more fulfilled later, but rather it's all going to come to pass in this short amount of time, just like is prophesied in Daniel and later in the book of Revelation. But the fulfillment of everything in this word means there is a judgment for the unbelieving, and there is an inheritance in the kingdom for those who believe. But once again, the only refuge, the only escape, the only deliverance, the only salvation from this wrath to come is through faith in Jesus Christ. And that's true of both Jews and Gentiles. All right, that's all of our message for this evening. We will close with a hymn.